Could the gods mentioned in Sumerian tablets really have been aliens? Were some of humanity's oldest written records actually describing beings that came from the sky? Or are we simply misreading the belief system of an ancient civilization through the lens of modern science fiction? That is the real question. Because when the subject is the Sumerians, the mystery grows very quickly. Symbols carved into clay tablets, gods, the heavens, powers descending to earth, the creation of humanity, great flood stories. And on top of all that, one modern word gets added, aliens. That is exactly why Sumerian tablets have long stood at the center not only of historical curiosity, but also of conspiracy theories, mystery hunters, and people who believe in ancient astronaut ideas. But there is a very important distinction here. If a text mentions gods coming from the sky, does that automatically mean it is talking about beings arriving in spacecraft? How accurate is it to interpret the gods of an ancient civilization as advanced non-human visitors with superior technology? And more importantly, is that what the tablets actually say? Because most of the time, people do not know the tablets themselves. They know later interpretations of the tablets. Sometimes they only know interpretations of interpretations. And little by little, the truth becomes buried under layers of fog. So let us go back in time. Back to Mesopotamia. To the fertile land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The place where cities rose, temples were built, writing was born, and state order began to take shape. The Sumerians created one of the oldest urban civilizations in human history. Cities like Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur were not only political centers. They were also sacred centers. Because in that world, a city and its god were not separate things. Every great city had its own protecting deity. If a city rose in power, its god rose with it. If a city fell, the power of its god was described as shaken. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe was not understood the way we understand it today. For them, heaven and earth were filled with living forces. Natural events were not just physical processes. A storm could be the anger of a god. Fertility could be the blessing of a god. Drought, plague, war, death, all of it belonged to a sacred order. That is why the gods in Sumerian texts do not appear as distant and abstract figures. They decide, they rule, they punish, they protect, they love, they envy, they destroy, they create. In other words, they stand above the human world, but they behave in ways that often feel strikingly human. Within this divine order, some of the most important names are Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Inanna. Anu is seen as a high authority of the heavens. Enlil is associated with air, wind, and sovereign power. Enki stands out through wisdom, water, intelligence, and creative thought. Inanna is the complex goddess of love, war, attraction, power, and political force. And when you read those names, it is not hard to understand why some people feel that these are more than ordinary mythological characters. Because these figures are sometimes described as coming from the heavens. Sometimes they appear to bring knowledge to humanity. Sometimes they are shown as higher beings who shape destiny itself. To a modern mind, these descriptions naturally raise another question. Were they really gods? Or were they foreign and powerful beings that ancient people could not fully understand? This is exactly where the name Anunnaki enters the picture. Today, on the internet, in documentaries, and in popular mystery content, the word Anunnaki is almost automatically used as if it means an alien race. But historically, the matter is far more complicated than that. In Mesopotamian texts, The Anunnaki are usually understood as a group or class of deities within the divine order. Their number, their role, and their function can change from one text to another. Sometimes they resemble a divine council. Sometimes they are connected to the underworld. Sometimes they appear as members of a sacred hierarchy surrounding the great gods. So they are not presented as a single, fixed, biologically defined alien species in the modern sense. So why do so many people believe the Anunnaki were aliens? There are several reasons. First, when people hear themes like descent from the sky, God's giving knowledge to humans, the creation of mankind, extremely long-lived rulers, and heavenly powers, they tend to reinterpret those themes through the language of modern technology. Second, mystery always attracts attention. And when the subject involves one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, hidden behind the deep fog of the past, imagination moves even faster. Third, from the 20th century onward, certain popular writers and media productions blended Mesopotamian mythology with science fiction and spread that mixture to millions of people. Over time, in the public imagination, the Sumerians and aliens became almost inseparable. But now we need to stop and ask a very simple question. If an ancient civilization described its gods as descending from the sky, does that really mean it was describing living beings from outer space? Or is this simply part of a broader sacred language found across many ancient cultures? Because not only the Sumerians but also Egyptians, Greeks, Indians, Turkic traditions, and the civilizations of the Americas all often linked the sky with the sacred. The heavens were associated with height, distance, order, power, and divine authority. So the phrase coming from the sky does not always mean literal space travel. Sometimes it simply means superiority, holiness, and transcendence. This is where the true fascination of the Sumerian tablets begins. Because these texts do not tell one single consistent story the way a modern novel would. They were written in different periods, in different cities, by different priestly circles, for different purposes. Some are hymns. Some support royal ideology. Some deal with creation. Some are ritual texts. Some are literary narratives. Some are prophecies, some are prayers, and some are tools of political legitimacy. In other words, we do not possess a document that says, "This is a Sumerian report of contact with extraterrestrials." What we do have is a complex collection of religious, political, and cultural texts. And the moment you ignore that distinction, you begin reading everything incorrectly. For example, some people look at the incredibly long reigns assigned to ancient kings in Mesopotamian king lists and see them as signs of non-human beings. Kings ruling for tens of thousands of years. That does not look like normal history. But in the ancient world, king lists were not always intended to function as objective chronological records in the way we expect today. They were also used to magnify sacred authority, glorify the past, and connect royal power to divine order. So those exaggerated lifespans may not represent biological reality. They may represent sacred greatness. A modern person may read that and think, then they could not have been human. An ancient person may have understood it very differently and thought, then they must have been closer to the gods. Another major issue is translation. Because ancient languages like Sumerian and Akkadian do not always produce one simple meaning when translated into modern language. A word can carry different shades of meaning depending on context. A poetic expression can be mistaken for a literal statement. A mythic image can be misread as a technical description. And many claims circulating online do not come directly from academic translations of tablets. They come from second-hand popular retellings, That means people are often not reading what the tablets actually say. They are reading what someone else claims the tablets say. And that is where the biggest distortion begins. Once a mistranslation or an exaggerated interpretation starts spreading, it gets repeated again and again. Eventually, fiction begins to stand in front of the real text. Now think about this. A civilization living thousands of years ago looks up at the stars, watches storms, watches sunrise, watches the phases of the moon, sees floods, drought, thunder, the night sky, and the movement of celestial bodies. But they do not explain these things with physics, chemistry, and astronomy the way we do. Instead, they create sacred stories. In those stories, there are gates of heaven, divine councils, powers that write destiny, gods who bring law, craft, fertility, punishment, or order to humanity. When a modern viewer hears this, it is natural to ask, could this be some kind of contact story? That is not an absurd question. But there is a problem. Asking a reasonable question does not mean you have found the right answer. Perhaps that is where the deeper attraction lies. Because Sumerian texts open two different doors to the modern mind. The first is the door of history and comparative religion. Through that door, what you see is one of humanity's oldest symbolic systems. Gods, order, chaos, fertility, death, justice, kingship, temples, and cosmic hierarchy. The second door is the door of speculation. Through that door, the same texts begin to look completely different. Gods, maybe astronauts, heaven, maybe outer space, divine knowledge, maybe advanced technology, creation stories, maybe genetic engineering. Popular culture loves the second door, because the mystery is larger there. The excitement is stronger. The story is easier to dramatize, but intellectual honesty demands something important. We do not have clear and direct evidence in Sumerian tablets that says biological beings came down from outer space to Earth. We do not have technical explanations showing that the gods were operating spacecraft. We do not have records that describe an interstellar civilization in the modern sense. What we do have is the sacred language, symbolism, and worldview of an ancient society. And that does not make the subject less exciting. In fact, it makes it more interesting. Because the real tension is not in a final answer, but in the boundary between interpretation and evidence. How much do we actually know? How much are we assuming? And how much are we seeing simply because we want to see it? There's also the visual issue. In Mesopotamian art, we often see winged figures, sacred symbols, celestial discs, divine headdresses, and ritual scenes. The modern eye is extremely quick to interpret these as spacesuits, rockets, devices, energy symbols, or alien technology. But this is exactly where iconography requires caution. A symbol must be read within the religious and artistic tradition of the culture that produced it. Otherwise, every circle becomes a UFO, every ceremonial crown becomes a helmet, and every beam of light becomes rocket fire. And then we are no longer reading history. We are reading our own imagination. Still, let us be honest. Why is this idea so powerful? Why do so many people search for traces of visitors from the stars in tablets that are thousands of years old? Because the human mind is built to look for patterns, especially when the material is ancient, incomplete, and mysterious. The older something is, the more fragmented it is, the less certain it is. The more stories begin to gather around it. And the Sumerians offer the perfect ground for that. They are ancient. Their texts are fragmentary. Their language is difficult. Their worldview is foreign to us. And above all, they are genuinely fascinating. That fascination can inspire real study, but it can also generate myth. Now we come to one of the most frequently discussed points: the creation of humanity. Because one of the most popular claims in ancient astronaut theories revolves around this idea. Some people try to read Mesopotamian creation stories as if they were accounts of genetic engineering. The gods created humanity. Therefore, perhaps a superior species performed experiments on primitive humans. It sounds dramatic. It sounds cinematic. It even sounds like science fiction. But the basic purpose of ancient creation myths was not to provide a laboratory report. Their purpose was to explain cosmic order, the human place in the world, the meaning of labor, the relationship between humanity and the divine, and the sacred structure of society. In other words, they answer the question, how was humanity created, in a cultural and religious sense, not in a biological one. So when we read metaphor as biology and sacred narrative as technology, we can very easily lose the real meaning. At the same time, something else is true. In some Sumerian and broader Mesopotamian traditions, the gods do appear as beings who give order, knowledge, city life, law, and civilization to humanity. And to the modern imagination, that immediately raises another possibility. Could a higher intelligence have set human civilization in motion? But here again, another question appears. Do we actually need an alien hypothesis to explain the rise of civilization? Archaeology shows that human communities, over thousands of years, developed agriculture, writing, urbanization, legal systems, and religious institutions through accumulated observation, social organization, experimentation, and cultural memory. So while the idea of outside intervention may sound exciting, it requires evidence. And at least for now, that evidence is not there. Perhaps the real problem is that when we look at the past, we swing between two extremes. On one side are those who dismiss everything as mere fantasy. On the other are those who treat every metaphor as encrypted evidence of alien technology. But the language of ancient civilizations is richer than either of those extremes. When a society speaks of its gods, it is also speaking of its fears, its hopes, its struggle with nature, its political order, its understanding of death, and its place in the universe. Gods are not only supernatural beings. They are also a culture's way of understanding itself. That is why the real question is not simply, were they real or not? The deeper question is, what was that civilization trying to express through those figures? Even so, speculation is not entirely useless, because sometimes unusual questions force us to look more carefully at the sources. Asking, what if they were aliens, may not produce a historically verified answer, but it can drive people toward the tablets, toward cuneiform, toward Mesopotamian mythology, and toward the history of religion. The problem is not the question itself. The problem is treating the question as if it were already the answer, turning a possibility into certainty. That is where the line between science and legend begins. Science speaks only as far as the evidence allows. Legend fills the empty spaces with passion, and we have to admit, empty spaces are irresistible. Because who would not want to believe it? That in the age when writing was first born, beings descended from the sky and handed civilization to humanity. The moment you hear that idea, all of history changes color. Pyramids, ziggurats, stars, lost knowledge, floods, gods, forbidden wisdom. All of it starts to look like part of some enormous cosmic story. That narrative is deeply seductive. because it makes the past more mysterious, and it places the present inside a much larger drama. Humanity stops looking ordinary. It begins to seem like the continuation of some forgotten experiment. That emotional pull is powerful. And that is exactly why the idea refuses to disappear. But being powerful is not the same thing as being true. In history, just as today, the ideas that spread most widely are not always the ideas with the strongest evidence. Sometimes the most dramatic ideas spread. Sometimes the most frightening. Sometimes the most romantic. The claim that Sumerian gods were aliens survives because it contains all of that. Mystery, rebellion, forbidden knowledge. A challenge to official history. People become intensely attentive when they are told there is a hidden truth that others do not want them to know. That psychology is one of the strongest fuels behind ancient astronaut narratives. So if we want to arrive at an honest conclusion, what should we say? We should say this. There is no direct and conclusive evidence that the gods mentioned in Sumerian tablets were aliens. The tablets are understood primarily as religious and mythological texts. The Anunnaki, in historical context, are interpreted as a group of deities within the Mesopotamian pantheon. But at the same time, something else is also true. The language of these texts is so ancient, so symbolic, and so powerful that the modern mind does not see only history in them. It also sees possibility. And sometimes that feeling of possibility begins to overpower the evidence. Maybe the best approach is this. Do not dismiss everything as simple myth. But do not declare everything to be hidden alien history either. Instead, approach Sumerian texts with both respect and curiosity. Try to understand them within the world that produced them. And then leave open a more careful possibility. Humanity may indeed still misunderstand some aspects of ancient texts. But what we are misunderstanding does not have to be extraterrestrial. Sometimes what we fail to understand is simply the ancient human mind itself. And that may be even more astonishing than the alien theory, because think about what we are really doing. We are looking at signs impressed into clay 5,000 years ago. A tablet lifted out of the earth. A world belonging to scribes, priests, kings, and temples. And that silent piece of clay still makes us speak. Still makes us argue. Still gives birth to new stories. Is that not incredible on its own? Perhaps that is the true power of the tablets. They do not only tell us about the past, they also reveal something about us. They reveal what we want to believe, how we fill in the gaps, how quickly we create legends when faced with mystery. So maybe the final question should be this. Were the gods in the Sumerian tablets really aliens? Perhaps not. Perhaps we simply do not have enough evidence to say that. But one thing is certain. These texts are among the oldest mirrors showing how humanity looked at the sky, how it sanctified power, and how it turned the unknown into gods. And perhaps what fascinates us most is not the alien possibility itself, but the sheer scale of the stories the human mind was already capable of creating thousands of years ago. So the answer is not a simple yes. And it is not a simple no either. At least not for the popular imagination. But from a historical point of view, what we have are not alien reports. What we have are sacred narratives. And yet those narratives are so powerful and so deep that even now, we still want to read them again and assign new meanings to them. Perhaps that is the real secret of the Anunnaki. Not whether they truly came from the stars, but why we keep wanting to place them among the stars. And this is where the mystery does not end. It begins again. Because when the past falls silent, what usually starts speaking is not the documents themselves, but interpretation. The Sumerian tablets are still there, silent, heavy, ancient, but our age keeps pouring its own fears, hopes, and cosmic fantasies into that silence. Maybe one day a new tablet will be found. Maybe a new translation will clarify some hidden detail. Maybe a future discovery will sharpen what we think we know. But with the evidence available today, the strongest thing we can say is this: the gods of Sumer have not been proven to be aliens. Yet in the imagination of the modern world, they have already become children of the stars, and perhaps that is why the Sumerian tablets are more than archaeological artifacts. They are ancient mirrors reflecting the modern age back at itself. Some people see religion in them. Some see history. Some see the birth of civilization. Some see forgotten masters descending from the heavens. But whichever side you stand on, one thing is difficult to deny. These tablets still keep one of humanity's greatest questions alive. Did we really build everything on this world entirely by ourselves? Or is there some deeper secret in the past that we still have not learned to read correctly? Maybe the answer is not inside the tablets, Maybe the answer is in the eyes that read them.